Hello everybody, and thank you Guido for the introduction. So what are we going to talk about today? I will tell you why it's a good idea to have a firewall configured on a domain controller. I will then show you a project of mine on which I've been working for the past 2 years maybe. The project simplifies the firewall deployment a lot. And then I will share some gotchas with you. We are going to talk about outbound traffic, about remote procedure call traffic, because these are like really beasts, very problematic things. So let's go. Why should you properly configure a firewall on a domain controller? How could it help you? So first of all, this is the situation I see quite often when doing any kind of security assessment, and the typical answer from their network department is, hey, we have our Cisco firewalls or Checkpoint, FortiGate, whatever you name it, and that's enough. We don't need to care about Windows firewall. We don't need to care about host-based firewall. But what are the risks? So there might be some protocol vulnerabilities, like this one. You might remember the BlueKeep vulnerability in the RDP protocol, and obviously if that was exposed to the entire network, you could attack the domain controllers. But that's easy to firewall. What is more complex is RPC. So in May in this year, a serious vulnerability was discovered in the legacy Microsoft Event Log protocol, and it could lead to remote code execution. So remote code execution against the domain controller is always a serious thing. Yeah. Then even without a vulnerability, attackers use pass the hash when they compromise some sensitive credentials. They could create services remotely. They could manage scheduled tasks and do many interesting things over the regular management protocols. So it might be a good idea to restrict those protocols. Another popular thingy is NTLM relay attacks, together with authentication coercion attacks, when you tell a domain controller to connect to some endpoint and then you relay the identity of the domain controller, the authentication of the domain controller to some other network endpoint, and you can basically impersonate it. So what you see here is the desired state, how Windows Firewall should be configured. You see that in many of those rules, you have IP addresses configured for like specific network ranges from which you'd like that specific protocol, that specific service to be available. What is a problem here? The documentation isn't very well telling you like what should and shouldn't be enabled on a domain controller, and if you have many rules with the same IP addresses and then you want to add something to the network, or if you want to change some IP address, you need to manually change it in many different rules, and it's a very tedious and error-prone task. Yeah. Then another issue is with remote procedure call protocols, which can be tunneled over the SMB protocol. So if you have a network firewall looking at SMB traffic on port 455, you would see something like this: encrypted SMB free, but the firewall doesn't know whether this is really an access to a file share to sysvol, whether someone is downloading group policy from the sysvol, or whether someone is creating a service, or whether someone is creating a scheduled task. And that's a huge problem, that this is not just file and printer sharing. This is remote computer management as well, if you have enough permissions. So deploying host-based firewalls is really critical. Now let's look at protocol classification. So who thinks that remote desktop protocol should be open to each and every client? Okay, who thinks it's something which should be restricted? Yeah, thanks. That's easy, that's obvious. That's a protocol for remote management, so you want to restrict that access. But now let's look at the LDAP protocol. Who thinks it's a client protocol? Thank you. And who thinks it's a management protocol? Protocol for performing remote management. Yeah, and both groups were right. Yeah, with some protocols, you cannot distinguish between those usages. Yeah, which poses some limitations to what you can do with network firewall rules at the network layer, and additional hardening must obviously be done at the application layer, at the permissions layer. Also, I know that any firewall configuration is only a part of a bigger picture of domain controller security hardening. And there are many more activities you should do, you should perform, and I'm not gonna tackle them. Yeah, so I will just take this one piece of a puzzle and talk about it now. But in the defense in-depth approach, you should obviously deploy multiple layers of security. This is only one of those layers. No, it shouldn't be the only layer. And during this conference, you've seen a lot of like identity-centric security stuff, zero trust, and so on. But if you don't get the basics right, if you don't get network security right, then you cannot build upon it, and you cannot add additional security components. So let's look at the domain controller firewall project of mine. So the goal of that project is to get a group policy object configured in Active Directory, which contains not only firewall configuration, but also some startup script for settings which cannot be configured in a different way, some administrative templates for DNS client and for some other network protocols, and so on. And this group policy object is generated through PowerShell. Yeah, it's not created manually, it's created automatically based on a JSON configuration file. Yeah, so you create a JSON file, say what the name of that group policy should be, what settings should be included, and then you run the PowerShell script and it creates that GPO with all those IP addresses in those rules and so on. So let me show you a demo of that. So here I am on a domain controller, and I know I probably shouldn't be running Visual Studio Code on a domain controller, but hey, you need to have some courage, right? And this is only a test environment. Okay, so this is how the configuration file looks like. Is it readable, or should I zoom it in a little bit more? Okay. Was okay, but you are in the front row, Guido. So here you see some IP addresses of domain controllers from which some replication traffic would be allowed. We don't care about client addresses, so we keep it to any. But what is very important is management IP addresses. So some subnet where privileged access workstations are located, or some jump servers, whatever you have for remote Active Directory management. And if you hover on top of any of those settings, you get some documentation from Visual Studio showing you like what that configuration setting means. If you try to add some value, it shows you like in what format you can provide the IP address, yeah, so that so that you see how you can write IP version 4 and IP version 6 subnet ranges and so on. And if I remove some of those settings from here, it's showing me which settings are still missing from the configuration file, so that I can like very quickly configure this thing. And it provides some default values, some recommended values for some static port number, and so on. Okay, so this is how the configuration file looks like. And now I will run the PowerShell script. It's doing some validation, so it's showing me that my settings are not compatible with Systems Center Configuration Manager client being running on these domain controllers. It's also showing me that I configured the log file size with incorrect value, which violates some security standards, which violates the recommendation in Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit. Yeah, so it is now connecting to the domain controller, and you see that it is creating firewall rules, registry settings. It's deploying custom administrative templates to the central ADMX store if one exists on the domain controller, and so on. So now if I switch to the GPOs, you see that I have one additional group policy object in place, which previously wasn't here. The GPO is not linked anywhere, yeah, because it's dangerous, like to get it linked to the domain controller's OU right away. So you should do some sanity check. You should see if whatever you have here makes sense or not. So here we have some firewall configuration and a lot of inbound rules. There was also a startup script. So let me try to connect to Sysvol. So if I go to the machine, scripts, startup, here it is. So it's some batch file configuring a static port number for distributed file system replication. It configures firewall log file, because there's a bug in group policy, and this doesn't work when you do it with regular GPOs, so you also need to ping it through the network shell. And it also launches network shell with this script file. And if you look into this file, it configures a lot of RPC filters, but I'm going to talk about those a little bit later. And now if I wish to change anything here, so for example, a new domain controller had been added or is going to be added into that environment, I will just add one more IP address, relaunch the script, and it will do a remediation and reconfigure that group policy object. Yeah, so it's re-entrant, and it will change the things based on the configuration file. But I don't want to wait for that. I hope you believe me that those addresses would be changed. You can also configure custom rules, so you can add an additional PowerShell file to that, which will be executed. Here is an example for some Paris tools, for some Paris agent, which you might have on that DC, and we'll add the appropriate exception. Yeah, so obviously you might be running some agents, some other components on DCs, and you need to think about them before deploying that firewall. Here is an output of a PowerShell script of mine, which I typically use in customer environments to map various network services running on Windows servers and specifically on domain controllers. So it shows me what TCP and UDP ports are open on that machine, similarly to the netstat tool in Windows, right? It's showing which process is listening on that port, and also which services are running in that process. Yeah, so that can give me some better visibility. And like, unfortunately, the organizations where I come to typically don't even know what's running on their servers. So it's a good idea not to trust them, not to believe them, and do a check of your own. You also need to fetch like the list of features and applications installed on those machines in order not to block anything important, anything crucial. The group policy object also enables logging into a text file, but it's a tab delimited file, so I've created a PowerShell script which passes that and shows it to you in a table or in an Excel file, so that you see if any sort of traffic was blocked on that particular domain controller, so that they do some more troubleshooting. And yeah, sometimes you just need to do troubleshooting. So this will show you which packets, what communication was dropped on that system. As part of this project, I've also created a white paper with Pavel Formanek, who's my former colleague from Microsoft, who he was also a PFE for identity and security. And when we started writing this document on like how firewall should be configured on domain controllers, we didn't expect to end up with a 120-page document. But this is how big the white paper is. But it contains like everything you need to know, all the details, every protocol, every port. It contains documentation of all the built-in firewall rules which are in Windows, which are related to Active Directory, like which services are mapped onto which rule, which port numbers are matched to each rule, and so on. There are also some checklists from STIC, you know, from the Department of Defense. We also have a mapping of the configuration file, of the JSON configuration file, which you have seen, to CIS benchmarks, Center for Internet Security. And we also do a mapping of those settings onto Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit. So you get those checklists and you will see whether you are compliant. So some of the requirements you would be compliant out of the box, like you deploy this project and you will be compliant. But then with some other settings, you need to provide a specific value, or you need to enable some specific thing in the configuration file to be compliant with that standard. And everything is written in this document. And I really like this post on Reddit when someone called this a Bible for Windows firewall, or specifically for domain controller firewall. I started working on a similar thing for Active Directory certificate services for various roles, but that documentation and tool is in its very, very early stage. Yeah, so this was the domain controller firewall project. Now let's look at outbound traffic, because this project only handles inbound traffic and blocking of inbound traffic. So why would you even consider blocking outbound traffic? Well, NTLM relay attacks, we already mentioned them, or you might get some command and control channel communication on the DC, which could be blocked, data exfiltration, whatever. Yeah. But it's easier said than done. And like, I really don't want to be bad, but I think that nobody at Microsoft in the Windows Server product team actually tested Windows Firewall on a production server, especially on a domain controller, because when you try to enable that, and by the way, who's already tried to enable like the outbound traffic blocking by default on a domain controller? And did it work for you? Broke a lot of things, even replication stuff, yeah, which you would think that it would work with the built-in firewall rules which are in Windows. Yeah, so inbound rules work, but outbound they don't cover everything. And then there are some issues, some gotchas. Yeah, so I try to configure Firewall for a Windows Update service so that it can connect to Windows Server Update services or to Microsoft Update. But as it turns out, this service impersonates the user who clicks the Check for Updates button. And that means you cannot target this service with the firewall rule, or you need to enable outbound traffic for all services, not just for the Windows Update service. Yeah, so it just breaks the purpose of even configuring the firewall at all. Or scheduled tasks. Yeah, so most of the scheduled tasks execute some other processes, but not this task, and additional ones which contain custom handlers, which is DLL file loaded into the task scheduler. That means if you want to enable outbound traffic for this, you need to enable outbound traffic for all scheduled tasks. Yeah, you cannot target this one. Then you might go hybrid, right? And you might try to deploy Azure Arc onto a domain controller to get hot patching feature, yeah, because it's a nice feature in Windows Server 2025, but it depends on Azure Arc. It's provided together with the Azure Arc license. And as part of that, you get some PowerShell scripts, which you can use to configure the service or to check for updates, check whether the service is running, and so on. What this means? I like PowerShell, but if you want to have Azure Arc, you need to enable outbound traffic for PowerShell, for all PowerShell scripts, including malicious PowerShell scripts. Yeah, so it beats the purpose of even blocking traffic at all if you wanna deploy that component. By the way, funny thing about Azure Arc, when you deploy that, it creates this firewall rule called SME outbound open exception. And if you try to Google up this Azure Arc firewall rule, you will, or if you try to Bing it up to make Microsoft guys here happy, you will only get one result, which is my own website. Yeah, but nowhere else you will find any info on this Azure Arc firewall tool. And as you can see, it only contains some Microsoft IP addresses, and I do not want to add stuff like this into my own project because it would be unmaintainable for me. Yeah? I would need to be checking in what version of Azure Arc the list of IP addresses gets changed. Yeah. Then you obviously want to be secure, so you deploy Microsoft Defender for Identity, and Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Yeah, so what can go wrong with firewall outbound traffic? Well, Defender for Identity connects to each and every workstation over SMB, DCOM, NetBIOS, and Remote Desktop Protocol. So you need to enable this kind of traffic from domain controllers, and you open the doors for NTLM relay attacks by doing that. And if you look at Microsoft's documentation, you get a huge Excel file with multiple sheets containing the list of all endpoints which need to be enabled so that these agents, Defender agents, work so that they can connect to the cloud service, which is a problem by itself because the built-in firewall capabilities can only work with IP addresses, they cannot work with DNS names. So I try to bypass that using so-called black hole proxy. Yeah, so I used network shell to configure all those DNS names from Microsoft Defender to so that the computer connects to them directly, and for any other traffic to use a proxy port on the local host which doesn't exist. Yeah, that's why it is called a black hole proxy. And it worked for a while, but eventually I started getting errors. Even on the newest Windows server, it would break, and you couldn't even reset the proxy configuration. Reboot didn't help, and you needed to delete an entire branch in the registry to fix that. So I decided not to include this capability in the Active Directory firewall project. It wasn't reliable enough. Yeah, and I wasn't able to troubleshoot it. I'm not sure what exactly happened. I didn't give it that much time. Another interesting feature in Windows Firewall is called dynamic keywords. And for dynamic keywords, you can actually associate DNS names with firewall rules, but not with firewall rules configured by group policy, only with firewall rules configured by Intune. And that won't work on domain controllers. Yeah, so it doesn't even make sense to configure that. An interesting feature is currently in preview for client computers, Zero Trust DNS or ZTDNS, which is nice and would probably solve the issue of filtering the outbound traffic. But currently it's not available for Windows Server, and we'll see if and in what form it will be available in the future. But this is my only hope, actually. So conclusion, the result of this: don't even try to block outbound traffic yet. It's futile. It will break. Yeah, I spent a lot of time playing with it. You don't need to. Trust me. So what can you do? You can configure third-party proxy servers for which you would direct the traffic. And now let's have 1 minute of silence for Microsoft's threat management gateway. So unfortunately, we no longer have a first-party product for this from Microsoft. What else can you do? You can deploy Microsoft Defender Exploit Guard Network Protection, which contains a list of known malicious IP addresses like botnets and so on. And if your system tries to connect to such IP address, well, on a client computer, you would get this pop-up bubble telling you that the connection was blocked. If you add one additional setting to group policy, it will also work on domain controllers on Windows servers. So I would definitely recommend you to do this, to deploy this, and it's actually also part of the domain controller firewall project. But there's one setting for that. You don't need to deploy it if you don't want to, if you don't wish to. So this was the outbound traffic. Now let's look at RPC traffic, remote procedure call traffic. Yeah, that's a beast, and very few people understand the remote procedure call protocol. And I really like this quote from NetPile, a former Microsoft employee, who said that the documentation was probably written by alien hybrids for robot lawyers, and it doesn't contain any understandable information at all. I want to have at least one AI slide in this presentation because it's 2025. So I asked some AI to generate a picture of that. So here you see a robot lawyer in a suit talking to an alien. Yeah, so this is the probably the situation, so that you can better imagine the process of writing the documentation for RPC. I've read the documentation. I've read the documentation of most RPC protocols. So one problem is that many RPC-based services are using random port numbers. So it's very hard to configure that on Firewall. But some of these services, like NTDS service, netlogon service, and so on, can be configured to use a static port number through registry settings, but there is no GUI for configuring that. So I created my own custom administrative template which exposes this functionality, and where you can configure static port numbers for some of these services. Another issue with RPC, as we already mentioned, is RPC over named pipes. So if you enable this first rule, SAM protocol, or the third one, file and printer sharing, it also enables all of the other things, all of the other protocols, even though they are not explicitly enabled. Because all of these rules only enable inbound communication to port 445. So by enabling file and printer sharing, you also enable remote service management, which is a bummer, obviously. So yeah, not good at all. And actually, last year in November, I met a guy in Chicago who was part of the original team who invented this thingy. He admitted that, and he told me that he was very sorry. Okay, so what can you do? You can use a poorly documented feature of Windows Firewall, or of the Windows filtering platform, called RPC filters. And this is how you can configure such a filter using the network shell tool. And you can say that if an RPC packet matches this protocol UID, which is the ID of the remote service management protocol, and if that goes over NCACN_NP or named pipes, then it would be blocked. And you then only enable service management on a standalone RPC port number, which you can properly firewall, but it will block that communication on port 445 on file and printer sharing, which needs to be enabled on domain controllers for group policies to work, right? And it can get wild, because then you also have remote scheduled task management. And if you wanna block that, there are 3 different protocols. You need to block all 3 protocols. You need to know the protocol IDs. Then you need to block some stuff from the encrypting file system, and from the EvenBlock remote protocol, and from other protocols which are typically used for coercion attacks, for MPLM relay attacks. I won't go into the details, but you remember there is this 120-page document which contains all of this, including the explanation, like what means what. Yeah, so it's not very user-friendly. Then some of you probably know the DC sync attack, or the abuse of the replication protocol to fetch secrets from Active Directory. This is how you can get KERP-TGT using my own PowerShell module, which could then be used as a precursor for so-called golden ticket attack. Very nasty thing. But you cannot block the replication protocol. You cannot limit the replication protocol to domain controllers. Why? Because if you look at the operation, yeah, you would probably want to block the operation free. You would probably want to restrict it to DCs, the get naming context changes. But then you have some management calls, which would be used by administrators. And then these 2 operations crack names and the bind are used by each and every client computer during the logon process. So if you block that, you would have issues logging into Windows. Yeah, because the crack names, you are not cracking anything. This is the function used to translate username to the security identifier of the user, and vice versa. Yeah, you could use LDAP, but someone wise decided to use the replication protocol for that. Yeah, so you cannot block that. But here comes Windows Server 2025 to the scene, and a new capability to block specific operation numbers, to use specific RPC operation numbers in the RPC filters. So what can you do here? You can say that if the traffic is through the replication protocol, here is the GUID. And operation number 3, the get NC changes. And the IP address is this one. The tool only works with hex representations of IP addresses, but it's configurable. You would need to create these rules for all the domain controllers, for all the IP addresses of domain controllers. And then you would create another rule, a default rule, a fallback rule, which would say anything else block. Yeah? And you would then restrict the replication protocol to the domain controllers, maybe to Entra ID Connect and to some additional components which actually need to do replication. SharePoint Enterprise also uses the replication protocol, for example. And you also get events in the security event log if you enable that capability, and you see that the operation number 3 was performed from this IP address. Very, very nice thing. Yeah, so this is a new capability of Windows Server 2025. But the management layer is bad, is terrible. And that's why I decided to release a new PowerShell module. I released that PowerShell module 2 weeks ago, and it's called dsinternals.rpc filters. Why a new PowerShell module? Why not add it to my existing PowerShell module? Well, my PowerShell module is flagged by various security tools, including CrowdStrike and Defender for Endpoint. So I wanted to have something different, which cannot be used for malicious purposes, which can only be used to do the good stuff. So here is a command from that PowerShell module, and I don't need to work with operation numbers and with protocol IDs. I will only say that I want to handle the get naming context changes operation, and I want to permit it from this IP address, and I also want to enable auditing. And I can actually also provide a name and description for that rule, which Network Shell doesn't allow you to do. So it's always called RPC filter. Yeah, so you can add some documentation to that as well. Then there is the get RPC filter command, which shows you all the existing rules in the local firewall configuration in the Windows filtering platform. And again, you see that the IP addresses are translated properly. The tool supports many built-in protocols in Windows. So although in the rule is a GUID of the protocol, or UUID to be more precise, you get the actual name of the protocol, a human readable name. And also for the operation number, you get a human readable name of that operation. So it translates everything. Another command, get RPC filter event, can connect to a domain controller or any system, either locally or remotely, and it shows you the security event log. Again, all the data is parsed, so if it knows a specific operation, it translates it into a human readable name, protocol is translated, authentication type 6, I think, is translated to Kerberos and so on. Yeah, so it makes it readable. It makes it more understandable. Yeah, and authentication level 6 bucket privacy. And you see if that communication was allowed or if it was dropped by the firewall. And I really want this module to be used in production environments. So everything is open source, everything is published at GitHub. It uses deterministic builds so that you can validate that the binary were really produced from the GitHub repository. Everything's digitally signed and so on, to give you some more trust into this tooling. So everything you've seen today is available at firewall.dsinternals.com. There is online HTML form of the documentation. You can download the PDF file. You can download the PowerShell scripts for configuring Firewall. And again, everything is in GitHub. The PDF file and the website is generated from the GitHub repository from a set of text files. So if you find any errors, any problems in the documentation, feel free to send a pull request to that repository, and when accepted, a new version of the documentation would be released. And I'm quite glad, happy that community has already noticed, and I had incredible feedback to this, and people have helped me to make it even better. So this is it. This is what I've been doing, or one of the things I've been doing during the past 2 years.
Amazing stuff. We've got a few more minutes for some questions if you have some, because I mean, it did take you 2 years, that whole project, to actually complete that, right?
It's a 120-page document. It's a book. Yeah, it's writing a book.
Yeah,
for which you needed to do research and a lot of trial and error, I have to admit.
I can imagine. Anyone have a question for Michael? Want to get up to the microphones up here, so I don't need to run around so much?
What if you're...
You can also lower it.
I think it'll work. Yeah. What if you're already running Sentinel-1 firewall, just the basics? Is this something you can turn on in addition to Sentinel-1 firewall? So we're doing host-based firewalls with Sentinel-1 already, but not to this extent. Are those going to be able to...
Yeah, this is for Windows firewall. If you are using a third-party solution, then consult that third-party solution, like how to configure those things. And the basics you can take from this document, and the RPC filters can typically be combined with third-party firewalls, because they both are using the same Windows filtering platform. So it can be combined, but I only targeted the Windows stuff. But if you look into the documentation, into that PDF file, it also contains a reference of all the port numbers used by Windows, which service is using that port number, and so on. And that could not only help you to configure Windows firewall, but any third-party firewall to properly allow Active Directory traffic. Yeah, so that was the intention.
So the intellectual property on the firewall information in that document is transferable wherever. The scripts to then set the settings, they're made for the Windows firewall.
Exactly.
Yeah. Makes sense. Any other question? Yep. Get up, Jimmy.
Yeah, so we're speaking about domain controllers here a lot, and like the get-nc changes API, the opnam 3, it's also used by other things than domain controller, as you know. So for example, Entra ID Connect is using that if you're syncing the password hashes to Entra ID. Have you seen any more
examples of like common products or technologies that uses that outside of like domain controllers and RIDE Connect?
Yeah, the question was which products use the replication protocol to replicate data. I don't know of that many. You mentioned Entra. I previously already mentioned SharePoint Enterprise when you do user profile synchronization. And I remember some Cisco thingy, some network acceleration product, which name I don't remember properly, but it was doing basically man-in-the-middle attack to exchange communication, and was compressing exchange data. And for it to be able to do this, it needed to know the passwords of the users. A very similar feature is also contained in Riverbed Steelhead, a competing product to this Cisco WAAS, and it's also doing the replication of secrets from Active Directory, which is quite dangerous, allowing that this sort of access to some boxes which are located in all of the branch offices. Yeah, not just in HQ.
And maybe for those that are wondering, DSP is also using the replication API to get changes, but we do so locally on the domain controller, not by remotely accessing it. Have an agent, and then the agent sends it back to DSP. Just because I was also wondering, we might have to add the DSP management server to that, but I don't think so either, because it's local. Anyways, we're out of time now. Thank you so much again, Michael.
Thank
Your
you.
applause.